Good morning. We are up to Chavtes Amud Beis 29b3. The last thing we discussed was the Persian practice of eating meat without bread, which at the time was seen as a rather odd thing to do. Again, most people were eating meat with bread, and this pertained to a discussion about what we do for what the amount of meat is needed for an Eruv. It was based on, do we look at what the Persians do and say, okay, well, since the Persians eat meat alone, therefore you need a larger amount of meat, right? If you're just eating meat without bread, you're going to have, 2 large slices of meat, because each one's going to be one for one meal, one for the other. If you're going to have it with bread, then it's going to be a much smaller amount. Rav Yosef said, well, look, the Persians eat meat alone, and therefore, to make an Eruv with meat, you need a much larger amount, because that's what the Persians do. Now, Abaye rejected this because Abaye said, at the end of the day, the fact that the Persians do this, how does that impact the rest of the people? And Abaye is going to bring a proof to the fact that we don't care about, each person, each place does what they do, and the practices of others do not impact them. So Abaye wants to bring a proof to the fact, again, Rav Yosef was saying, look, once the Persians do it, we should all do it. Now, I want to just remind ourselves before we see this proof that it's a chumrah. Rav Yosef's view over here is a stringency, because if we go what most people do aside from the Persians, then how much meat is it? It's a much smaller amount, because most people eat a small amount of meat and they eat it with bread. And therefore, those who argue with Rav Yosef would say a small amount of meat is sufficient. Rav Yosef says, no, since the Persians eat meat alone, therefore we need a much larger amount, because you need enough for 2 meals independently. Eating it without bread is obviously going to be a much larger amount. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. So Abaye is going to bring a proof against Rav Yosef that we don't look at what others do, we look at what the individual or what that group does, and what others do doesn't impact them. So he's going to bring a proof from a different set of laws, which is the laws of Tumah. Okay, so with the laws of Tumah, impurity, that in order for something to become tamei, in order for clothing to become tamei, it has to be defined as a clothing. How large is a piece to be defined as a clothing? If I have, someone does some tailoring and the tailor leaves you like a little strip of material, is that a piece of clothing? So the Gemara distinguishes between poor people and people who are rich. Whatever. Basically, laying out these two sides of the socioeconomic society, in the sense that there are those who are much more comfortable, and therefore for them it's going to be a piece of 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim, a much larger piece, because for them a smaller piece is just a scrap, they'll throw it out, whereas a person who is much more impoverished, for them it's going to be something as small as 3 fingers by 3 fingers, okay? And now the question is going to be, though, what if a wealthy person's piece of clothing is in the hands of someone who is not wealthy, right? So that's going to be the discussion, where it's going to be a similar parallel, where it's going to be something which is not, there's different categories, and it's going to be in the hands of someone who doesn't necessarily use that type of size. Let's see, that's not. It was taught in the Mishnah, Big Aniyim Laniyim, clothing of poor people, which is 3 fingers by 3 fingers, is going to be tamei when it's in the possession of a impoverished person. Big Ashirim Lashirim, the clothing of a wealthy person who will only use a piece which is 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim, which is much larger, then it's going to be tamei when it's in the possession of a wealthy person. And now we're up to Lamed Amud Aleph. Aval Big Ashirim Laniyim Lo, but the clothing of a wealthy person in the hands of a poor person, we do not say it goes as much as 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim, but even if it's going to be 3 fingers by 3 fingers. In other words, let's say a wealthy person has a piece of material left over from some tailoring, and it's small. It's 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim. It's this big, little patch. And an impoverished person is handling it. It belongs to the wealthy person, but an impoverished person is handling it. So the halacha there is that we don't wait until it's large enough, even if it's very small. We treat it with basically we use the measurements of the impoverished person. So you see that the one person's, we don't say, oh look, since for the wealthy people it's going to be much larger, the measurement's much larger, that should impact the impoverished person. We say no, the wealthy people, when it's by the wealthy person it's one thing, when it's by the impoverished person it's another measurement. So you see that one person's customs should not affect the customs of someone else. It depends who it is. So if you're in Persia, yes, it's going to be 2 full pieces of meat. If you're outside of Persia, it's going to be a small amount. This would seem to be a proof against Rav Yosef. The Gemara says, maybe you'll say that no, it's not a question, because maybe Rav Yosef would say that it's not that I hold this principle across the board. Meaning, it's not that I say that if I see this measurement, I see like some measurement in one place, I'm going to apply it everywhere. It's that in each place I'm going to go to the stringent view. When it comes to an Eruv, the stringent view is I'm going to need to have a much larger amount of meat because the people in Persia. When it comes to Tumah, I'm going to go in the more stringent view, which is the smaller amount, saying that if it's an impoverished person, I'm not going to go with the what we'll call a leniency of saying it has to be 3 tefachim by 3 tefachim. I go with the stringent view of being 3 by 3. In other words, in each case, I'm going to go lechumra. The Gemara says that's not true. That if you're making an error for a sick or elderly person eats a much smaller amount, so they get a smaller amount. And here's the key words: and let's say you have the term is a glutton. It's not a very politically correct term, but let's say you have a person who just eats a lot, a person who eats a ton of food. Nonetheless, so how large is their eruv? Rav Shimon Elazar says their eruv is the amount for most people. Even though this gluttonous person eats a tremendous amount of food, nonetheless we give that person a smaller amount. And so you see that we don't treat each situation on their own. We do go with the leniency based on other people's consumption, kasha, and therefore it is a difficulty on Rav Yosef, who wanted to say that we're going to go with the more stringent view of the people of Persia, because at the end of the day we see that if there are people who eat a smaller amount, that should impact everyone else. Okay, so again, according to Rav Yosef, if there are people who eat more, if there are people who eat a larger amounts, we're going to go with that stringency. We're going to go with that larger amount. But we see from this brisa and from these line of questions that shouldn't be the case. We should go with the more lenient view and use for an error of what is used for normal consumption or by most people and not based on the outliers. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara further. Rav Shimon ben Elazar really say that a glutton's eruv is we're going to use an average person's needs. Vatanya was taught in a brisa again by a totally separate set of lachos. So here's the set of lachos. Let's say there is a corpse in this building. Okay, let's say there's a corpse in this building, and this building was adjacent to another building, okay? And there was an entranceway that was open between two buildings, okay? So the tumah, the impurity, would travel from this building to that building, okay? It's going to go through that entranceway. Where it gets tricky is, let's say we have a bunch of doors like this room, and there's a corpse. Someone passed away over here. So obviously everything in this room is going to be tameh. The question is, which doorway does it go through, okay? Which doorway does it go through? So typically what we'll say is that if there is one doorway that is 4 tefachim, it's 4 tefachim wide, about 8 feet. 4 amos wide. Is it 4 tefachim? I forgot. 4 tefachim wide. 4 tefachim wide, which is not that large. And then we're going to say that door. If one doorway is larger than the others, we're going to say it goes through that doorway, the doorway of 4 tefachim. The question is, what about a very large person? How do we assess things over there? Because a large person is not going to fit through a door. 4 tefachim is not that large. It's pretty small. So what do we do with a large person? So the Gemara says, Rav Shimon Elazar really say that when it comes to an eruv, that even if a person eats a lot, we still use an average amount of food for that person. Vatanya, it was taught in a brisa, which seems to contradict this. The brisa says, Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, Og melech habashan pischo kimelo. That Og melech habashan, who was a giant, it's just a term whenever we want to talk about a really large person, the nickname in halacha is Og. We call the person an Og. It just means someone who's very large. Okay, so there the halacha is that the door that is going to be the one that causes tumah to go through it is the door that fits his size, and we don't go with the 4 tefachim size. So you see that we do go with that it is subjective. That's the core of the question over here. In other words, Rav Shimon Elazar is saying that we don't go with the norm, rather we go with what is appropriate for that person. By the way, the principle behind this, I should have explained, the reason that we say that tumah only travels through the 4 tefach door is, why not through all the doorways? The reason is because we know, or we could assume, that the person, the corpse, is likely going to be brought through that doorway. And therefore, even before he is brought through that doorway, we still treat it as if he went through already, right? And therefore, if there's a bunch of doors, but one door is 4 tefachim, we say that's the way the tumah goes through, even before it goes through. And therefore, okay, fine. But when it comes to Og, what the Gemara says, we don't go with 4 tefachim, we go by his size. We go for the much larger door. Implication, even if there are other doors which are all 4 tefachim, but there's one door that's much larger, we go through a much larger door. So you see, there's subjectivity. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? There's no question. The Abaye responds, he says, no. Hasam heichli avid hadomin hasam heichli avid. There, regarding the tumah, heichli avid, what can we do? Hadomin hadme v'napke, are we going to dismember the body? We're going to cut up the body and then remove it? Okay, in other words, what he's saying is like this. When it comes to tumah, the reason that the tumah travels through a certain place is because we know the body's going to go through that place. And therefore, so it's a very practical question. Where is the body going to go through? practically, because we know the body's going to go through a certain door, and therefore when it's a regular sized person and there's one door 4 tefachim, and then we say okay, it goes through the 4 tefach door. If there are a bunch of doors that are 4 tefachim, then it goes through all the doors because he can equally go through them. When it comes to a very large person, if they're all 4 tefachim but one of them is larger, then we say it's going to go through that door. Why? Because the Rabbi says, because practically, we're obviously going to put him through that door. Yeah, it's true that there are 4 tefach doors, but there's no way in the world we're going to take a huge person through a 4 tefach door. It's not practical. So that's by Tumah. Because the question is a very practical question. Where's he going to go through? We're not going to, and we have to get the person out of this room. When it comes to Eruv, is the person necessarily going to eat the Eruv? No. The Eruv, again, the Eruv here in Baltimore, in any city, sits and waits for years, right? Doesn't do anything. So it's not a practical question of what's the person going to eat. The question is, what is relevant to a person, right? In one case, so he says, it's apples and oranges. You can't ask me a question from the case of Tumah where it's a real practical question of where's the guy going through, as opposed to the case of the Eruv, which is a very, as opposed to the case of Eruv, which is more of a theoretical thing. We need the person to be potentially eating this food. And therefore there's no question. Fine. Ibailahu, the Gemara asks, Pliger Rabbanan later of Shimon Elazar Alo, Rav Shimon Elazar who said about the glutton, eating the regular food, that we set aside regular food for a glutton. Do the rabbis disagree or not? Tashmar, we try to bring a proof. Damar Rabba Barachana Amar Rav Yochanan Og Melech Bashan Pischo Barba. Okay, so sorry. Do the rabbis disagree? Sorry, about the opinion about the corpse. Rav Shimon Elazar said that we take the person out from the large door, and it's only the large door. Do the rabbis disagree? The Gemara tries to bring a proof. Tashmad Rabbi Yochanan Og Melech Bashan Pischo Be'arba. Rabbi Yochanan says that the door of a giant is 4 tefachim, which seems to contradict Rav Shimon Elazar, who said that it's much larger. So the Gemara says no, there's no proof from there. Hasani Gipsachim Tanam Tuva Vikachad Haverba Devadiki Kamarvach Bahu Karmavach. So the Gemara says no. Rav Yochanan's talking about a case not where. So Rav Shimon Elazar was talking about a case where all the doors were 4 tefachim and one of them was very large. There, Rav Shimon Elazar said we're going to go through the very large door. Rav Yochanan, who we said is arguing, Rav Shimon Elazar is not arguing. He's talking about a case where all the doors are smaller than 4 and one door is 4. There, we'd also say that by definition he's going to go through the larger door. So there's no machlokes, and it's not that we're saying, it's not that we're saying that 4. In other words, there's no proof that they would argue with Rav Shimon Elazar in a case where you have 4 tefachim, 4 tefachim, 4 tefachim, and one very large. There, maybe they agree. Rav Yochanan's case was talking about a case where all the doors are 2 tefachim, very small, and one door was 4 tefachim. There, the rabbis would say we go through that door. Okay, I know this is a little bit. Not so relevant to us, okay? But let's go further. Amrav Chia Baravashi Amarav. New piece. If you didn't follow until now, let's start again. Ma'arv Masar Chai. You're allowed to make an Eruv with raw meat, okay? And as we saw earlier, raw meat doesn't mean really raw meat. It just means something. It's meat which is like it could mostly raw or meat that's very salted. The point that has to be something which could be edible. So good things to keep in mind. If a person is sitting on a vacation or something and they have to make an Eruv. By the way, I forgot to mention I was away 2 weeks ago and. So we take Eruvin for granted, and where we were, so someone, there was like 15 rabbis in the place, whatever. Anyways, it was like the whole Baltimore Vada Rabbanim was literally in that place in a 4-block radius. Anyway, the point is that one of the rabbis asked one of the people there, is the Eruv kosher? He's like, of course, the Eruv's always kosher. He's like, when was the last time it was checked? Well, and all of a sudden, they're running around before Shabbos. The Eruv was like totally not kosher. And not totally not kosher, I shouldn't say that. There was serious questions about the Eruv, and they had to fix the Eruv. Bottom line is, knowing some of these halachos could be very relevant, because then they had to go make phone calls and I didn't know till after. I came back after. I was like, oh, I could have paskin everything. No, just kidding. But the bottom line is that these things come up. So let's say a person has to make then you have to put food aside, right? And let's say you didn't have matzah. Let's say you're traveling and all you have is a little bit of food. So you have to know what types of foods are available. So one of the things that we're learning over here is not just food which is like matzah or regular food. Even food which is not the most is not. Most typical food, but it's a food that could be eaten. If you're really hungry, really stuck, you could eat like semi-raw meat. It's edible. It's not the most, typically we're not going to eat it, but if it's like heavily salted or is roasted a little bit and it's like very, very, very like pretty raw, you still would eat it. So therefore the bottom line is we're learning over here that it doesn't have to be food which is like perfectly made. Even if it's food that you'd eat, if you're really pushed, you'd eat it, that would be okay. Okay, fine. Amarav Simi Bar Chia Ma'arvin Bebeitzim Chayos, also raw eggs. Back in the day, singers used to swallow, used to have raw eggs. Okay, I don't know if it worked, but that's what they did. I don't know where they came from. Vikama, how many eggs? Amarav Chia Bar Yitzchak Achas, he says 1. Sinai Amar Shtayim. Sinai says 2. Now the truth is there was no Amora named Sinai. It was actually a nickname for Rav Yosef. He was nicknamed Sinai because he knew all the Torah like he was like Har Sinai. It's a cool nickname to have. Okay, fine. Bottom line is, now we get into a discussion about borei minei mizonos. We've been talking a lot about brachos, and there is a discussion elsewhere in brachos about what foods do you make borei minei mizonos. What's the halacha? What foods do you make borei minei mizonos on? Bracha B? We eat the 5 grains, typically. Okay, but there is a discussion about rice. Okay, do you make mizonos on rice? Rav and Shmuel say you do not make a mizonos on rice. Okay, and the others say you do. Now again, the bracha is borei minei mizonos. It's a funny bracha. So when we think about it, what it means, God who makes different types of mazon, we typically translate as satiating food. Now that's as we're about to see, it's not necessarily the most accurate translation, and that's going to be part of our discussion over here. So it says the Gemara, Hanodrim and Amazon mutter b'mayim. The Mishnah taught us that a person makes a vow not to have sustenance, mazon. They're allowed to drink water and salt. Okay, they're allowed to have water and salt. They can't have anything else. They can't have anything else. Says the Gemara, Melech Umayim Hudlo Ikri Mazon, Hakol Mili Ikri Mazon. The implication is, person says, I'm not making a neder on mazon. They could have, they can't have any food. Implication is, all foods are called mazon. Right? In other words, what's the Gemara say? The Gemara says, if I make a vow, I will never have anything called mazon. Okay? Then I'm only allowed to have water and salt. That means that all other foods are called mazon. That's what it means. So the Gemara says, Leiman Tepet Yuf to Rav Shmuel. This should be a refutation to the ruling of Rav and Shmuel. To Rav Shmuel, Dramit Tervayu, Ein Mevarchim Borei Minei Mizonos, Ela Al Chameshes Minim Levad. They said you only make the bracha of Borei Minei Mizonos only on the 5 grains. Our Mishnah implies that there are other things that are called sustenance. Right? So, right, this would be a contradiction, because according to the bracha borei minei mizonos should be much broader based on our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said a person who says, I will not have anything that is called mazon, they're not allowed to have any food except for water and salt, which are not considered mazon. But that means that so much more than the 5 grains are called mazon. Yet Rav and Shmuel say it's only the 5 grains which are called mazon. So Gemara says, Lo svina chad zimna. What are you doing over here? We already refuted their statement in brachos a few masechtas ago. So why are you doing this again? So the Gemara says, Lemet hav tiyuvta nami meha. We'll say there's another refutation from our Mishnah. Granted, we already asked a question from them in masechtas brachos from a different Mishnah, but there's another question from our Mishnah. So Rav Huna says, no, there's no question from our Mishnah, but Omer kol hazan alai. Our Mishnah says, or reread our Mishnah. The Mishnah wasn't Hanodrim in Hamazon, which is someone from sustenance, but rather anything that satisfies me, which is much more, which is, I'll explain in a minute. Then, Mayim Malachut Lo Zaini, Hakol Mili Zaini, water and salt do not satisfy, all other items satisfy. So what's going on over here? What's going on over here is as follows. There's a discussion, the debate about what is the word mazon. When we say borei minei mizonos, what is that going to include? Rav and Shmuel say that only includes things which, the word mazon, the way Rashi explains is that it's something which sustains the heart. It's something which is going to give like a lot of energy, a lot of strength. And Rav and Shmuel say that it only includes the 5 grains. In brachos, there's a discussion where we ultimately don't rule like that. What do we rule? We rule like that if a person eats rice, you also say mizonos, okay? Important halacha. Whereas there was one difference though, you do not say al hamichya after having rice, you say bar nefashos, whereas for the 5 grains, you do say al hamichya. Fine. But our Mishnah, we're saying, is not a question, because our Mishnah, you could read it, not that they said mazon, which would be anything which satiates, and which would then be a question of Rav and Shmuel, because we're clearly including more than the 5 grains. Rather, our Mishnah said kol hazan, anything that satiates me, not something which gives like strength. In other words, I could get full on, right? We always tell our kids, like, don't eat so many candies because you're going to get full, right? So is that something which gives you strength? No. It's something which kills, I don't know, whatever. It's not good for you. But it's something which will still fill you up, right? So mazon is really where Rav and Shmuel are arguing about. Is it something which gives strength? Rav and Shmuel say 5 grains, yes. Rice, no. The rabbis and the way we paskin is a no. It's a little broader than that. It includes other things. Our Mishnah is not a question, Rav and Shmuel, because we don't have to read our Mishnah to be talking about mazon, which would then be a question, because then we'd say, oh, it's a proof that you could say borei minei mizonos on more things than 5 grains. Rather, our Mishnah was saying, kol hazan, anything which fills you up. Yeah, and that's going to be a lot of things. Water may not be filling. We could debate that. Water, salt, not filling. Other things are going to be filling. And therefore, the Gemara is saying there's no question on Rav and Shmuel. Okay, and now the Gemara just questions, is it true that other foods could satiate? Okay, so a couple of times throughout the Gemara, the fruits of Ginosar are mentioned. By the Kinneret, there were these fruits that were grown, and they were seen as like exceptionally delicious. And Kiavina Beimea, when we were 100 students accompanying Rav Yochanan was like the leading stage. So if there's 100 of us with him, Havim Naktina Lechol Chad V'Chad Asara, each of us would take 10 fruit for him. We would all pick fruit for our Rebbe. Kiavina Be'asar, when we were 10 people accompanying feeding him. We each take 100 fruit for him. The fruits were so big that 100 of them cannot fit into a basket of 3 sa, like a very large basket. In other words, they were huge fruits. Rabbi Yochanan would eat all the 1,000 fruits. Okay, the Gemara, whenever the Gemara uses these types of terms, it's typically exaggerating. The point is, he ate a lot of these fruits, and he'd say, "Shvuat lo tamali ziyuna." I swear that I'm not full. So you see that foods don't satisfy. Right, so basically you see, so the Gemara over here is trying to argue that that all foods could satisfy, and yet you see Rav Yochanan eating significant amounts of fruits and saying it doesn't satisfy. So the Gemara says, Ema mizona, it doesn't mean, change the terminology there too. It doesn't say that I'm not full, but rather say I've not eaten sustaining food, because fruits are not sustaining food. If you have a meal of fruits, it's not the same as having a meal of grains, and therefore again, no question, we could be satiated by other foods. Okay, now we have machlokas. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, if a person says, I swear I'll not eat this bread, right? But shvosh lo ochal kikar zo, I'll not eat this bread. Ma'arvin lo ba. Rav Huna says you are allowed to make an eruv with that bread. Why? The person can't eat the food. And the point is that if I say I can't eat something, I can still benefit from it, right? So I can still benefit that it's part of my eruv, even though I personally cannot go and eat it, right? So Rav Yehuda is saying, if I say I cannot eat this bread, that bread could still be used as my eruv. However, if I say kikar zo alai, if I say this bread is prohibited to me, meaning I can't have benefit from it, ema arvin loba, we do not make an eruv from it. Okay? So that's Rav Huna's chiddush. Rav Huna is saying that if a person says, I will not eat this bread, I could make an eruv with it. If he says this bread is forbidden to me, then I cannot use it because the person cannot benefit from it. The Gemara asks the question, Meisvei hanoder min kikar ma arvin loba, a person makes a vow from bread, you are allowed to make an eruv from it. My lav de amar alai. Is it not talking about a case where he said, I won't have any benefit from it, which would then be a question on Rav Huna, who said, if I will not have benefit, I cannot use this bread. Gemara says, lo, de amar zo. We're talking about a case where the person said, I will not eat this bread, and therefore other benefits would be allowed, and therefore there's no question from that brisa. Hachinam mistaber, the Baram brings a proof, because the end of the brisa says, Iktani seifa, emasai, when is it so? Bizman sha'amar shvua shlo at amena. When I say I will not taste it, right? When I'll taste it, which implies the prohibition that he's, the neder, the vow that he's making is I will not eat it, right? That's when it could be used. The implication is of al amar alai, but if he says to me, if he says it's forbidden to me, then the implication is hachinami de im arvin loba. If he says to me, meaning I will not have any benefit from it, the implication is that indeed it will be not be able to be used for an eruv, which is a proof to Rav, or at least not a question to Rav Huna. Ask the Gemara, Yihachi, we're at 38.3, Yihachi Netani, Kikar Zo Hektish, Ema Arvin Loba. The Brisa continues and says, if a person goes ahead and uses bread that is, if a person goes ahead and is makdish their bread, right? Back in the day, a person could still do this. It would be a really bad idea, but a person could go ahead and say, I'm taking this food or this item and I'm giving it to the Beis HaMikdash. You know, back in the day, that'd be fine. You go and you give it to the Beis HaMikdash. Nowadays, you'd be stuck. You don't know what to do with it. But the Gemara, the Brisa says, if I say this bread should be consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash, then you can't use it as an eruv. Since you're not allowed to make an eruv using consecrated objects, because it's forbidden to everyone. So the Gemara asked, if Rav Huna's right, that there is a distinction between a case where I say I won't eat it, as opposed to a case where I won't benefit from it, if that is really an important distinction, then liflov listening b'dida. Why doesn't the Brisa distinguish explicitly between those two cases? In other words, there is a general rule. Whenever we want to teach something, we want to give the most similar cases and contrast. So why does the Brisa say one case by neder, it says it's good, by hektish it's not good? Even within neder, even within vows, there's one case which is good and one case which is not good. It would be much more tight, it would be much more precise to do it that way. Say, when I say the bread cannot be eaten by me, I can use the eruv. Then the eruv is good for me. When I say the bread is forbidden to me, I can't. Why did we instead say eruv case versus hektish case? It's much broader. It doesn't teach us. It'd be much better to teach us a tighter case. So liflog this midah. We should differentiate between the same case of a vow. But and it should have said medvar murim damar zo. When is it forbidden? When I say when can it be used? When I say this bread I will not eat. Avol amar alai imar v'laba. When I say I will not benefit, then the eruv cannot be used. So amar lach Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, okay, great question. Elamai kol heichad amar alai ma'arvin kasha reisha. But in the beginning, the Brisa, the earlier statement of the Brisa said explicitly, it's when the person said, the brisa said specifically when I say I will not taste it, so that supports me. So this brisa is confusing. On the one hand, it specifies like Rav Huna, where it says I will not taste. That's the case we're talking about. At the same time, you have this good question about the contrast. The Gemara says Chasur Mechsura v'achrik tani. This is the way to read the brisa. Hanodim in a kikar ma'arvin laba. A person who vows from bread, you could make an error from it. Vafilu amar alai. Even if the person said this bread is prohibited to me. You could still make an error of nasik omer shvua shlo atamena. It's as if the person said, "I will not taste it." In other words, right now the way they're reading the brisa, the only way to make sense of the brisa is to say that the brisa, because there's a contradiction within the brisa. The Gemara says, really, even if the person does forbid the bread entirely, say, "I will not have any benefit from it," it's going to be allowed to be used. Why? Because we treat it as if the person said, "I will not taste it." And this would then pose a question of Rav Huna. We'll review and come back to this, God willing, tomorrow. Okay, I know we're in the middle of a piece. We'll come back. A little complicated. We'll review and come back tomorrow. Have a great day.